Okay, good evening. We have a very nice crowd already watching on Lifelong Jewish Learning. So thank you, Michael, for setting this up. Good evening, everyone joining us on Facebook. Tonight, I am feeling honored to have an interview with my esteemed, older, wiser brother-in-law, Rabbi Chaim Dovid Janowski, who is, besides having the merit and honor of being married to my sister, he's also the Rosh Yeshiva of the Mesifta in Coral Springs, the boys' high school. We worked together when I first moved to Coral Springs. We were actually colleagues for a few years, and now we get to enjoy each other from a distance. But distance makes the heart grow fonder. So
only because of COVID. Only because of
COVID. That's why we're sitting virtually distant, even though we're sitting really close. And tonight's learning is going to be in the merit of Chaim David's sister for a complete Yehudas Beila Bas Kendall Chaya. She should have a complete Chana. She should have a complete refuah shlema. She should be complete healing and health. God willing, only good things. So, really, Rabbi Janowski doesn't need a lot of introductions. These 12 years or 13 years, 12 years teaching. I always would tell people that I wish that when I was in yeshiva, when I was in high school, I had a teacher like Chaim Dovid. I would have been better off for it. But when I was growing up, many years ago, right, in the olden times, teachers did it. The Rosh Yeshivas understood less about education than I think they do today.
Is this about me or is it about the Rambam?
It's the introduction. So
Okay.
that's my introduction to you. Chaim Dovid, before we even get to talk about the Rambam and all that, if you don't mind, for 2 minutes, just introduce yourself to our community. Tell us where you're from, a little bit about yourself.
I am Chaim Dovid Janowski is my full name. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up in Toronto, and I went through the Lubavitch school system. I got a smicha in Eretz Yisrael, and I am currently living in Coral Springs, and we have a wonderful yeshiva here that, Rabbi Yankee said, we started together, and it's flourishing, and I think it is our 12th year. I have lost count. I don't count those things. For me, it feels like it was yesterday. So that's
to me, it's a very distant memory. To me, anything pre-COVID is a distant memory. Talking about like January, it's like many, many years ago. And so long. Just Corona is like a lifetime of its own. So, okay. So when I was speaking to you earlier today, I found out that one of the questions very often, I have a lot of guests on my Shabbos table or my holiday table. So we go around the table and we ask different questions. And one of my favorite questions is, I'm sure you heard my father ask this question as well. So you go back in history, who is your Jewish hero? Or if you can go back into history, who would be the Jewish biblical character or historical character that you would be most interested in being able to sit down and have a cup of coffee with or l'chaim with, talking to them? And so Rabbi Janowski told me that the character of history that most intrigues him, that he'd be most interested in meeting, is the Rambam, also known, or more famously known as Maimonides. So before we even get to why, first tell us about the Rambam. Give us some of the background of the history about who the Rambam is.
So the Rambam actually had a very tumultuous life. He was born in 1135 in Spain, and legend has it that the reason why I say legend is because there's lots of stories that are really inconclusive that we haven't been able to verify, but it seems that his mother died while she was during childbirth, and so the Rambam grew up as an orphan. His father had remarried afterwards and had another son whose name was David. So, and Rambam, who was Moshe ben Maimon, so Moshe, was actually very close with his brother. So they grew up in Spain. They had to flee from the Muslim part of Spain to the Christian part of Spain. He was 13 years old when that happened. And when he was in his, when he was 16 years old, he wrote his first book. He authored a book on philosophy. that very few people know about. And
What
he
was that book called?
Sefer Higoyin. I forgot the full name.
Okay.
Sefer Higoyin something. It's I don't even know. We may have some uh, pages of it, but I don't think we have. In fact, most of the writings that that the Rambam has supposedly written, we actually we have so much of what the Rambam wrote, but most of it is we don't have today, even though we have so much. So it's pretty astounding how much he actually wrote during his time, his short life, relatively short lifespan, and a life full of a lot of trials, as I'll just quickly outline. So when he was in his 20s, his father and his whole family, they traveled to Morocco, Fez. And over there in Morocco, he lived for 4 years. And he actually was forced to flee. A lot of people don't know this, he was incarcerated when he was 30 years old in Morocco. It's pretty amazing story. It kind of tells you a little bit about the personality. You sometimes get a glimpse. It's difficult to really get the personality of any rabbi in their halachic writings, but sometimes in these stories and in their personal letters, you get a lot more. So there was he was walking. It was Sukkot time, and he was walking with his lulav and esrog, the branch and the different, the 4 species. And a Muslim individual who was an influential individual started making fun, started berating the Rambam for these seemingly illogical items that he seemed meaningless items. So the Rambam went ahead and proceeded to belittle Islam's meaningless and traditions that seem to also bear no meaning. And as a result, he was arrested, he was incarcerated, and there was a very influential nobleman within the palace that bribed the guards to actually get him out of jail. And the Rambam realized he had to leave, and that's what actually led him to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel. So when he was 30, he went to Israel, and at that
When he
time,
went to Israel, he was married. He had kids.
yes, he was married. He had 2. I don't know when he had 2 children, but he had 2 children, which we'll see is sadly they die when he goes to Egypt. His first wife and 2 children die in Egypt, but he has not yet. And he's 30 years. He took upon himself to write his commentary on Mishnah, and that took some time. And he wrote in Arabic. Almost all his books that he wrote were in Arabic, which is, except for one that we have, which is the magnum opus, the Maimonides, the halachic works, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. And so he went from Egypt to Israel. The boat ride, the ship that he took was it was almost going to capsize due to storms. And over there, he actually writes a letter penning his feelings then. And people don't realize the Rambam he was a Renaissance man. He was a complete individual. And he was a very emotional person as well. And he writes there about that he took upon an oath that for all generations, meaning his children and his great-grandchildren, his great-great-great-grandchildren, take upon themselves to fast during these 2 days during this ship ride. There was 2 stormy days where he thought he was going to die, and he davened and he prayed, and it was a fast day that he put aside, that he established for all his family members. So he comes to Israel, and that itself is a very powerful moment in regards to his visiting the Temple Mount. He describes in a letter. He didn't stay long there in Israel. Things didn't work out there, and that's when his father got sick. So he moved to Egypt, and specifically in Fustat, Egypt, which is about 2 miles probably away from Old Cairo. And over there, that's when really things took a turn, where his wife died, his father died, his 2 children died. He ended up remarrying. He had a son when he was 53 years old. His son, he named him Avram, And that's really where the most of his known life that we have today comes from Egypt. That's where he wrote his major work, and that's when he became a doctor.
You remarried?
He remarried. And his brother died. His brother was a partner. They had a business venture. His brother was a merchant, and he felt that there was a great business opportunity far off across the Indian Ocean. The Rambam actually tried pushing him not to go, but he didn't listen, and there was a shipwreck. He died, drowned, and all his fortune, because it was a major potential investment. All his fortune drowned with him. So the Rambam actually writes how it was about 1170 around this time. He was born in 1135, so around 1170, within that time period. The Rambam writes that he was depressed for the entire year. He was bedridden and sick. He couldn't find solace, the loss of his brother.
I never knew that.
Yeah,
he was in depression.
He writes that he was lying in bed and sick, and he couldn't find solace he says, out of all the things that happened in his life, the loss of his brother was the most heart-wrenching for him. I guess they were that close, and he said the only comfort he has found was absorbing himself in the four walls of Torah, and that's when, with a vengeance, he pursued and finished writing his halachic work, the great halachic work that we have. And then he became a doctor because his brother wasn't able to.
I'm going to interrupt you because I'm into the psychology and into the human message over here. I didn't know that, and I want to just
first of all, to make a disclaimer, because when we discuss someone like the Rambam, I personally have a lot of personal feelings and connection just reading a lot about him and learning from him. But we're just, in regards to understanding the Rambam, we're mere mortals. Reminds me of the story. I'll just finish off with the story, and then I'll stop hogging the conversation. The fifth Chabad Rebbe had once, the Rebbe Rashab, Rebbe Shalom Deber Schneerson, had a question on a mimer that he himself had on an idea in Chassidus, a Chassidic thought. And he sent this question to a rabbi, chassid of his. And the rabbi ignored him, didn't want to respond because he thought that he was just like toying with him. Like, obviously the Rebbe knows the answer to the question. And then the Rebbe frustratingly responds to him. He says, I wasn't asking him because I didn't understand it. I was asking because I wanted to know how human intellect could grasp such a concept. So when we're approaching the Rambam is way beyond us in understanding. He was a human being, but he had he was totally in touch from a godly, a godly dimension that whatever we could glean, any glimpse that we're getting is not, I don't think, the true form of the Rambam. But with that, go ahead, Yankee.
No, so that idea that the Rambam was in a serious state of depression and was able to pull himself out of that depression by truly throwing himself into a life's mission of studying Torah, that I think is a very powerful and meaningful story that probably many of us can relate to. No?
Yeah, no, that's one, I have to say the Rambam was not my lifelong idol. Sadly, Lahavdal Favdal is probably Mario Lemieux was when I grew up. I don't know if you know, but hockey, Wayne Gretzky, those kinds of that's really.
You're a Toronto boy, yeah.
That's really who. But as I started, learning the Rambam, you really gain to appreciate. And then when you read his letters, his writing, you see a full person, and the battles and the struggles that he dealt with. That I found that letter that the heartbreak and how honest he was with what he was going through and his ability to persevere, and how Torah really helped him deal with. He wasn't in denial. It wasn't like it was Torah actually pulled him out of this depression, which is very powerful.
Yes, that is amazing. That is amazing. So we'll get to his magnum opus soon. Tell us first about perhaps one of the most controversial works that he wrote, which was The Guide to the Perplexed. Or if you want to just talk about all the works that he wrote, then you can
No, the
decide
truth is, people don't realize it wasn't just the Guide to the Perplexed that was what bothered a lot of the rabbis. It was actually his halachic work, the major halachic work, and not just. I'm not talking about what Rabbi Yaki, you're probably referring to his nemesis, his arch nemesis, the Ravid, which we'll talk about, Rab Ben David. But his first volume has a lot of viewpoints that were considered, believe it or not, heretical by his first volume in his halachic work were considered heretical by some great rabbis. And to the point that students of these great rabbis, seemingly at the behest or based on the attitude that their teachers had, they burned the Rambam's works. They burned the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, because and the first volume. And in fact, 10 years after the burning of the Rambam's books, the Catholic, the Roman, it was the Roman Church actually went ahead and burned the Talmud. And they used almost, it seems like as an excuse that the Jews burnt their own books 10 years back. And one of the great rabbis that were fighting the Rambam was Rabbeinu Yonah of Granada, Spain. And he realized this mistake. He went on a total tour of penance and repentance, and he traveled. He made an oath that he's going to travel to ask for forgiveness by the Rambam's resting place in Tveria. And
by the way, that's the backdrop behind me is the resting place
is the entrance to the burial place in Tveria. And he actually, wherever he stopped, by every community, Rabbeinu Yonah, he gave a class and discussing the Rambam, and he would conclude, this is what Moshe ben Maimon said, and no one argues. And he would go from city to city. He died on the way. But that was the major impact. But yeah, there was a lot of controversy, to the point the Rambam actually said that people don't understand what I wrote, but in years to come, it will not be off the table of anyone.
So 2 valuable life lessons here. Number 1 is how the Rambam was by many misunderstood and totally maligned, and yet he persevered and was never distracted from his goal. But another very interesting thing that I'm taking, also new to me, about Rabbeinu Yonah not being embarrassed to say, I made a tremendous mistake. Halavai, if only today people could also admit that perhaps they made a mistake. And he didn't just say, I made a mistake, but to go publicly and to do everything he could to try and fix the record. These are amazing stories that have a lot of value to us today.
These little stories really have had a major impact in my just appreciation of our history, of what we have and who we are.
Okay, so what books did the Rambam write? He was a very prolific author. He wrote many books.
Yes. So there's books that we don't have even of. I'll tell you what I find, the reason why connecting with why I appreciate the Rambam so much is actually in what he wrote. It's almost like everything he wrote was never for himself. You find meaning, I'll give you an example. The Tosafists, or many people that wrote throughout Jewish history, you're almost getting a glimpse into their process, into their thinking process, into their analysis. It's almost like they're sharing a window of their learning experience. There's 2 sages you really don't get this very much from, where you see everything they wrote was for Bnei Yisrael, was for the Jewish people, they wrote as teachers, as leaders. Rashi and the Rambam. You find the Rambam's, you don't get a glimpse. I can't say you don't get a glimpse from his halachic work of how he thought. You do, but you have to really dig deep. The Rambam almost is giving you his end results. He's giving you his final conclusions of everything. He's not giving you he gives you little windows, little snippets, little moments you have in his analytical approach. but you're mostly like, he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. His goal was to explain the Mishnah. He knew he knew it, right? He wasn't giving you, it wasn't a process he was sharing with you. He had the final conclusions of how to understand the Mishnah. He felt it important to impart that information for others to be able to learn and understand the Mishnah. So he wrote a book on Sefer HaMitzvahs. He wanted to outline the mitzvahs of all the mitzvahs that we do, that exist in the Torah. That's literally for the Jewish people to learn, to appreciate. He was a teacher. In every work you find, it was about giving you information that you could live with. He wrote a book that, which we don't have today. He wrote a commentary on the Jerusalemite Talmud. Most people don't know about. He wrote similar to what his teacher's teacher, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, wrote one of the first major halachic codifying works on the Babylonian Talmud. The Rambam did that on the Jerusalemite Talmud. Again, a halachic work to give the information to let you be able to know how to conduct your life. So that's what I find very powerful about the things that he wrote. Besides the letters that he wrote and the philosophical work, the Mor Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. It was literally for students of his that had questions, and he shared. Yeah. So
you still didn't go through this. Give us a rundown of the different books that he wrote and what each one was. Yes. So
he wrote the Sefer HaMitzvahs. Sefer HaMitzvahs is a book going through the 613 commandments. There's major arguments about what are exactly the 613 commandments. In other words, everyone agrees primarily what the laws are. The question is if it's allowed or not allowed. But not everyone agrees on what are the 613 major commandments that all laws stem from. And there are significant applications by what you're going to count as a mitzvah or not. Yeah.
Explain that for a second, meaning no one argues if you're allowed to eat chametz on Pesach, for example. But whether you count not eating chametz as one prohibition and not having leavened products as a separate prohibition, or if they count as one, is
correct. Yeah. And what of the difference would be if there's a punishment, right? You give a punishment for a clear negative or positive commandment. If it's a halacha, then the court doesn't carry, there isn't specific punishments that would be meted out as a result of that. But there's a number of ramifications in regards to warning, to how you warn a person doing a mitzvah, korban, the sacrifices, and therefore it becomes important and technical on how to count them. And the Rambam, primarily though, the work wasn't about how to count the mitzvahs, commandments. It was more about sharing with you what the commandments are.
Go on. Okay, so that's one
the Sefer HaMitzvahs. Then he wrote, like we said, the commentary on the Mishnah, and that both of those he wrote in Arabic. He wrote the commentary on the Mishnah is a beautiful. It's a masterpiece on its own, and there's actually micro books on like sub books on the Mishnah. For example, he wrote an introduction to the Mishnah. That introduction to the Mishnah is a beautiful discussion on the entire thread of the oral tradition, and discusses he does discuss prophecy over there, but that's just another on the tractate of Sanhedrin in the Mishnah. He wrote a small book called the introduction to the 10th chapter or the 11th chapter, depending on how you count the chapters. He wrote the 13 fundamental fundamentals of Judaism, which that was like a small. It's a 4-page book, but that is literally outlining the fundamentals of Judaism, which people wrote books to counter that. You have, for example, the Rav Yitzchak Albo wrote a book to kind of say, no, there's only 3 fundamentals, not 13 fundamentals. So there was so much packed in each thing that the Rambam wrote that you have that. I mean, Rav Yitzchak Albo's book is a 2-volume masterpiece to try to contradict and to argue with the Rambam. So that you have that's the Mishnah. You have the Guide for the Perplexed, Mor Nevuchim, which is an amazing work on philosophy. It follows Aristotelian philosophy. The Rambam held very highly of the Aristotelian philosophy. That was I guess the science of the days back then. Sorry.
The philosophy.
Well, no, but there was a lot of scientific aspects that resulted from that philosophy. So that was they didn't have the science that we have today is very different than back then. But the Aristotelian philosophy was how people thought and how people processed information and phenomena. And so the Rambam veers from Aristotle, but but he gives a lot of reverence to Aristotle. The Rambam held Aristotle had the highest level of intellect that was humanly possible to attain. And that was one of the arguments that a lot of the German and French rabbis had with Rambam's devotion to Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy. And then there's the major work that the Rambam wrote, which is his Sefer Hayad, or Mishnah Torah, which is the 14-volume Sefer on all halachic and any halachic idea in Torah. The Rambam, what he did, it's a masterpiece. What he did was he said, to be able to know what to do, you don't need the Talmud, just look at Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and look at my work, and you'll be able to know what to do. And that is, and that's just, there's no one before him or after him that has written something as encompassing in the halachic genre as he has. Because his halachic, everyone before him and afterwards focused on relevant halachic ideas for in today's time during the destruction of the temple, where a lot of the commandments on halachic ideas aren't available now. And he felt, no, I'm going to write. I want you to be able to learn the entire Torah from a halachic perspective, to know what the Torah wants you to do and doesn't want you to do in any topic. And it's mind blowing to recognize that achievement. It took him 10 years. It took him 10 years to work on that.
Wow. Right, and if you learn through the Rambam, you learn through an in-depth halachic analysis of every single one of the 613 commandments.
Yeah.
Which is, there's no other book in Jewish law that's like that.
So there was someone that was similar that actually built off the Rambam. It was the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Chaim Michal Epstein, who he lived 200 and some years ago. And he wrote something called the Aruch HaShulchan, which is a shulchan. He took the code of Jewish law from Yosef Cairo and modernized it, because there was obviously an evolution of ideas and topics and discussions that were left out from 300 years before him. So he wrote that, and then he wrote an addendum to his Aruch HaShulchan called Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid, the Aruch HaShulchan of the future. And that is where he takes and develops the Rambam's halachic ideas for in the future from Mashiach comes. So
fascinating.
But it's not as it's different styles. It's a different style. It's not as well codified, and it's not as structured. The Rambam was such a methodical individual. It's mind blowing how he was able to structure and categorize everying.
Compartmentalize, yes.
You had to have this in mind before you even began writing it. It literally it's beautiful just to you read through it, you see what he was able to do.
Wow. Okay, so you said that you mentioned briefly before the Ravid, who very, very strongly opposed the writings of the Rambam. So explain the history of the Ravid, and also many of the people watching are not familiar with the whole Talmudic style of rabbinic debate and the passion of rabbinic debate.
So Maimonides, Rambam's approach was very, very simplistic. I'm going to give you the information without analysis. It could be it was very relevant for the people of in his community, in his surrounding. In fact, I have to say, the Rebbe points out, we have 2 signed copies that the Rambam actually handwritten of we have the first 2 volumes of the Rambam Sefer Hayad that were handwritten and signed by the Rambam. And the Rambam signs it, Rav Moshe ben Maimon Hasfardi. And the Rebbe points out, people question, why does he write Hasfardi? And the Rebbe points out two things. The Rebbe says, first of all, obviously, because maybe there was another Moshe ben Maimon, and the Rambam wanted to make clear that it was this one. But the Rebbe also points out that the Rambam understood that his process was different than others, and he wanted to say what he's writing is for the Sephardic world. This is for Moshe ben Maimon, who was the Sephardi. And it's in truth, the Ravid and the German and French rabbis they were very upset with the Rambam's approach because two things. This is all, what I'm saying now is just, I'm sharing my perspective. It could be wrong.
We love to hear your perspective.
This is just the Ashkenazic jury. They were not they weren't into philosophy. They didn't know all those kinds of things, and their intellectual pursuits, if they would have done away with the Talmud, it could have led them to foreign ideologies. This is what people suggest, which is why almost all Ashkenazic rabbis wrote their halachic works in connection to the Talmud. Always, you're able to thread back and find the Talmud. And one of the major halachic codifiers was Rabbeinu Asher, who his halachic commentary is an addendum to the Talmud. You cannot learn his halachic commentary it's a commentary. You cannot learn it without learning the Talmud as well. The Rambam was like doing away with the Talmud, and that really upset a lot of these rabbis. They felt that the Talmud is a necessary component, and therefore any halachic idea that you're processing has to be able to have evidence traced back to the Talmud. The Rambam did not write, there was not a single reference to the Talmud in any of it in this entire halachic work. And he doesn't even explain the process of what he got to his halachic decisions. So Rav Ram ben David, the Ravid, he lived in the same time as the Rambam, a little bit younger, I think. And he was very wealthy. He was a very, very powerful figure and respected figure, and therefore he built himself as the critic. He didn't just critique the Rambam. He critiqued, for example, there was three major people in his writings he's critiqued, and he was known as the Baal Hasagas, the master of critique. He was the criticizer. He criticized, well,
it's a very Jewish occupation to be the critiquer.
Yes, and he did write a lot of his independent books, but we don't have most of it. We only have, supposedly he wrote a commentary on the Talmud. We only have really one major sefer of his, and a Kabbalah. We have two Sfarim. He was a Kabbalist. His father-in-law was a major Kabbalist. His brother-in-law was Rabbi Isaac the Blind, who was known to be an extremely an ascetic and a very, very, very special Kabbalist, who was you could search him online, and so he was steeped in Kabbalah, the Ravid, and he attacks the Rambam it's a love-hate relationship. In regards to, sometimes you see there's a lot of respect in his comments, and sometimes he voices very strong attacks, like I can't believe an author would write something like this. It's juvenile. It's juvenile for the author to write something like this. And you almost see also sometimes his respect grows as he continues going through the volumes. But you could clearly see a lot of respect for the Rambam, even though there's this love-hate relationship. On the other hand, he's attacked, for example, a person, Reb Zerachia Halevi, who wrote a daring book when he was 18 years old to contradict one of the greatest halachic authors, the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fassi, who was the Rambam's teacher's teacher's teacher. So you're talking about an he lived in the 1000s. Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fassi was a giant. Everyone was afraid to touch him. And Reb Zerachia Halevi, as an 18-year-old, writes a book attacking the Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fassi's halachic decisions. And there, the Ravid leaves no regard, no respect. He attacks him. He calls him this Frenchie. He's a Tsarfati. called this Frenchie and he writes. Now, obviously, there's hidden love, but it's just it's quite fascinating. But anyway, so that's just so just to end off with a story. One of my favorite Maimonides figures is the Rogachover Goin, Rabbi Yosef Rosen, who the Rebbe he lived in the 1900s, and there's so much about him that could be a whole class for itself about the Rogachover Goin, the genius from Rogachov. But there was what he always argued. He always defended the Rambam. He held the Rambam was his giant, and he was. He died from a foot disease that they tried amputating his leg, and he ended up dying and suffering. He suffered greatly. It was before the Holocaust, right before the Holocaust. He once said while he was in the hospital, he said the reason why he's going through these the suffering is because the Ravid is getting back at him for always supporting the Rambam. Rambam is getting back at him. But he with like classic Rogachover, but he ends off. He says, "But what can I do if the Rambam is indeed correct?" So that was like his. So there, it's his history has been primarily though on the Rambam side in regards to the attacks. You feel that people have always defended the Rambam over the Ravid.
Okay, very interesting. Actually, I was about to ask you a question. So the Rambam, besides writing all these books, he was also a doctor. I don't know if you mentioned that. And that's a very important aspect of the Rambam's life. It definitely should be talked about for
it must be, and for the reason I think that the Rambam could have written a lot more if not for him being a doctor. The Rambam really finished. He became a doctor probably while he was finishing this major work, the Sefer Hayad. This major halachic work that he wrote, this 14-volume work. It happened, he became a doctor right after his brother David had passed away. He felt obligated to support David's wife and David's children. And he became a doctor because of that, by profession. And I shared this with you a few days ago because I happened to come upon a letter the Rambam writes to his student who lived in France, in Lunel province. And the student, Reb Shmuel Ibn Tabun, was the one who actually translated the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed in Hebrew. And this Reb Shmuel Ibn Tabun wanted to visit his teacher, the Rambam. And the letter, the Rambam writes back, first of all, how he would love to see him. It's just you get a lot of you see so much emotion in the Rambam's writing. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is the Rambam describes his daily schedule after he had become a doctor, and he tells he's describing the schedule not to flaunt how busy he was, but to tell his student that I would love you to come, but I need you to understand we are just going to be able to see each other. We won't even be able to discuss in learning your questions that you have in your need for translating my work. And we're just not going to get any learning discussed. We'll literally just be able to greet each other. And he describes there his daily schedule. We said he had to wake up early in the morning. He would have to go from Fastat to the old Cairo, and to visit the king, because he was the king's doctor. And when he was by the king, he would have to always tend to the king, always look at the king's family, and there would be ministers that would want to speak to him, the king's ministers and other well-connected individuals that would get a chance to see the Rambam. The Rambam said on a good day, he would never come home before midday. Half his day is gone. He would come back home, and and people already knew his schedule. He said the entrance of his home, the foyer, was filled with, he said they were filled with Gentiles, respected people, regular laymen, a whole mixture, waiting to meet the doctor, the Rambam, the philosopher, the Rambam. The Rambam would apologize. He said the only meal he would eat, he ate one meal a day, which is also mind-blowing because he's not following his own medical guidelines that he writes in his halachic work, and that's because he couldn't. You see literally a person that was not a personal individual. He was for the masses, and he describes there that they would be by him till night. He would lay in bed and still answering people's questions, and he couldn't get up from being so tired and weak. And that's his daily schedule. And he says, Shabbos is my only time. Listen, not to rest. Shabbos is my only time that I get to spend with the fellow Yidden and the Jewish people in the community. They would come to his house every Shabbos after Shachris, and they would discuss. He says light learning. That's what he writes. He says like you almost feel like he's
defined
begging.
as light learning?
But you almost feel like he's begging to really have a good chavrusa, and he just doesn't even have time for that. It says light learning, and then people go to daven, and then they come back to my house afterwards. Some people come back, and this is my weekly, daily schedule, and it's mind blowing. Like when I read that, I really saw a comparison between the Rambam and the Rebbe in regards to the Rebbe loved learning so much, yet he wasn't independent. He wasn't an individual. He was a person. People question, why didn't the Rebbe learn more? It's such a chutzpah. It's a chutzpah when you ask such a question. Just read this letter from the Rambam and ask the Rambam why he didn't learn more.
Right.
And
so, listening to what you're describing is exactly what I was thinking. That it gave me more of an appreciation why the Rebbe was such a devotee or a follower of the Rambam, because you see how their style and leadership and also the way that they learn Torah also is very much
very
same style.
Yes, the approach is the Rebbe. I think the Rebbe took the Rambam's. That's Rambam and Rashi both devoted themselves for the people.
To making things simple. I'll say this way: many rabbis like to make things more complicated.
Well, it
takes a true genius
also
to make
like they want. Well, it's not just about that. There is an appreciation of getting into the mind of the person, right? When you read the Tosafos, you're getting into the mind of their analysis. They're really trying to figure things out. Rambam and Rashi, they figure things out. They're giving you the information after it's figured out. They're telling you this is, and because they weren't there for themselves. They're there to tell you, we're here to help you. And I think, if you want to say it's a triangle between the Rambam, the Rebbe, and Rashi. And that's why the Rambam and Rashi, I think, are the Rebbe's greatest individuals in who he's always analyzed.
It's amazing. So that brings us to perhaps why we're discussing the Rambam. And the fact that I know you've studied the Rambam many times, the entire 14-volume set, correct? So the Rebbe actually instituted that we should study the Rambam on a daily basis in order to learn through the entire 14-volume Yad HaChazaka. Tell us about that and why the Rebbe made this decree for the Hasidim to do, and what it means in a practical sense.
So there's a couple reasons. In 1984, when the Rebbe came out with this campaign, the Rebbe explained the importance of two things. I would say the importance of learning the entire Torah. Number two, the importance of doing something in Torah in a unified fashion, as all Yidden, all Jewish people together. Now, there was people that were, right, there has been learning, mass learning, group learning. For example, you have Daf Yomi, right, the daily Daf. But that's not something that everyone's capable in doing. And everyone's capable of learning at the same level. You have, for men, women, and children, a book that encompasses the entire Torah. There's only one book, it's the Rambam. And for everyone to take that on, see, when you're learning Talmud, it automatically forces an analytical approach. And you can't tell everyone to learn a blot a day. You can tell everyone to learn an hour a day, right? To tell everyone to learn a blot a day for one person, it could take 5 hours.
A blot means a folio, a page,
a double-sided page. Yes, a double-sided page. Right. So there is a campaign to do that, which is a beautiful thing. But that's not something that you could say is equal, that everyone could do. But to say someone could learn a parak, a chapter, or 3 chapters of Rambam, everyone could learn Rambam at different levels. But at a very information-based level, There's no analysis necessary. It's literally consuming information. At that, you could give that amount. You could give an amount that is measured, that everyone is capable of doing. So because of those two reasons, the Rebbe felt it's crucial for Achdus Yisrael, for the unity of the Jewish people, and for the accomplishment of learning through the entire Torah, to take on the daily Rambam. Suppose Rabbi Feinstein's grandson attests that when the Rebbe came out with that campaign, Rabbi Feinstein started a daily learning cycle of this is what Mordechai Tendler attests, that Rabbi Feinstein started a daily Rambam learning cycle as a result of that campaign that the Rebbe took on. And so that's just that's the reason why that the Rebbe made this campaign. The Rebbe connected it to the coming of Mashiach. You're learning the halachas of Mashiach also. And when you learn about Mashiach, you that actually the words have impact, and it brings that on.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's very beautiful. So let's maybe ask you. You weren't expecting this question, but of all the Rambam that you've learned, what do you think has been the most interesting? There's 83 different sections. Just to clarify, there's 83 different sections of halacha that the Rambam covers. Of the 83 sections, which do you find the most interesting?
For me personally, it's the first volume.
Why?
The first volume, I have a little bit of a philosophical bend, and I appreciate core truths, big ideas, and it allows me to understand why things are the way they are, and why Judaism requires this or that. And the first volume, as the Rambam's methodical approach is, he basically covers the core beliefs and the core philosophical underpinnings of Judaism. And therefore, I just find that very, very powerful. And you see a much more obvious and unique perspective of the Rambam over other rabbis that makes it just something that's, and the boldness of the Rambam to go out and articulate these thoughts just make it, I find it very captivating.
Yeah. I find it a very interesting volume too, the first volume, definitely interesting. What's also, I should point out, is that now the entire Rambam...
What's your most interesting volume?
I can ask you the questions. My most interesting volume, probably, I would agree with you. I find the first volumes are interesting. I find the laws that are more relevant to like the daily living. So recently, like the laws of mourning and these laws, I find that more. There's a rabbi, something that's more relevant. So I was paying more attention when I was learning. So I study every single day the Rambam, as does Rabbi Janowski. He probably studies it much more in depth than I do. I actually very often take advantage of a translation of the Rambam, which is available for free on Chabad.org. If you go to Chabad.org/daily study, there's a translation in English, fairly simply written without too much confusion and technical scholarly language, that anyone could really study the Rambam if they wanted. And we just started a brand new daily study section this past week, exactly 1 week from today. So anyone can join.
We restarted from the beginning.
Right. And so me and you are doing the 3 chapter a day section, but there's also a 1 chapter a day, which if you're starting that, there's still a middle of going through the number of the commandments. So when we study the Rambam, we actually go through the entire list of every one of the 248 positive commandments and the 365 negative commandments that, as the Rambam codifies them, and again, different opinions hold differently. So you can join from the beginning of the laws of knowledge of God, laws of the knowledge of God. And any closing thoughts on the Rambam, or closing perhaps the story of the Rambam that you enjoy?
The problem with the stories of the Rambam are that they are legends, most of them. In other words, a lot of them, there isn't. I'll give you an example, a story that is written. I always found this very compelling, except it's questionable if it's true. There's a story from Shalshelis HaKabbalah, which is it's documented as Seder Adoris, which is a book which we value as being authentic. But the story has it that when the Rambam...
This is the problem, like, too scholarly, so you can't just share a good story. You start getting into the whole, if it's legit, if it's honest, if it's who said the story, what's the source of the story.
It doesn't shed the Rambam's father in good light, which in this regard, which is why I feel it's important to make that caveat. The Rambam was born, supposedly it is said that he was not studious and he did not have a good head. And the story has it that his father actually hit him for not learning, which, I mean, there was the practice in the Spanish, I guess, the Spanish Jewish conduct. And he ran away from home and ran to the shul, the synagogue, the local synagogue, and he cried. And a vision came to him, or whatever it was, that he should go to this individual, and it was Rabbi Yosef Migash. And he went to Rabbi Yosef Migash, he learned by him, and then he came back, and that's when his father realized how great the Rambam was, and he kissed him, and he took him back. The reason why I question the validity of the story is because the Rambam was, I think, either 9 years old when the Rimigash passed away. And the Rimigash was Maimon's teacher. Rabbi Yosef of Gash was Rambam's father's teacher. The Rambam always considered his father his teacher. So it's hard for me that's just why there's question that story. But I mean, the reason why it's a powerful story, if it's true, is because you're talking about an individual that wasn't born,
not naturally gifted,
wasn't naturally gifted.
One of the greatest scholars of all time.
I mean, there are real stories of people like that. The Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, had a student this 250 years ago, Ramosha Shik. When he came to the Chassam Sofer's yeshiva, Moshe Sofer's yeshiva, this is what he attests. He was not able to understand a simple page of Gemara. And he only through devotion, dedication, and he became the disciple, or the closest disciple of Ramosha Sofer, and really continued the Chassam Sofer's
Well, so that's amazing. That's amazing. I think that's one final takeaway message, because that's a very well-known story about the Rambam's difficult childhood, and it is not naturally being gifted, which, by the way, there's many even in contemporary thought, that people that are less naturally gifted but work harder actually become more successful and achieve more. Okay, thank you very much for a very enjoyable hour. Some fascinating stories, including some that I didn't know. Appreciation for definitely one of the people that would change the entire trajectory of Jewish learning, of Jewish thought, of where we approach Judaism, giving us a whole picture on the Rambam, on Torah. And I think that we're talking about this week because we've all just restarted a brand new daily studies of the Rambam. You can go to Chabad.org and anyone watching on a daily basis over the course of several years could study the entire 14-volume work and know the entire Torah.
And if you have any questions, you could always ask them to Rabbi Yankee. He studies the Rambam, and bother him. He would love to be bothered and badgered with questions on Rambam and stories versus any other questions. I guarantee you.
And any questions I don't know, I'll forward them to this WhatsApp group with Rabbi Janowski, Rabbi Raven, Rabbi Chaim, all the big scholars in town. I'll let them debate, and I'll come back to you with the answers if I'm the scholar. Anyway, Rabbi Janowski, thank you very, very much. That was truly enjoyable. It was a pleasure talking and hearing your insight and perspective. And I hope to do this again sometime. Okay.
Adwali, thank you for having me, and we'll see you, I'm sure, later.
Amen. Thank you very much. Good night. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you very, very much. Be well.